The night was unusually still. Eleanor Mendez noticed it first in the way her wind chimes hung motionless, despite the slight breeze she could feel on her skin. It was subtle, like the world holding its breath. She set her cup of chamomile tea on the counter and squinted out the window into the shadowy street of her quiet neighborhood. It was past midnight, but a strange, faint vibration hummed through the air, too low to hear but strong enough to feel. She dismissed it as her imagination, a symptom of too much caffeine and too little sleep. Since retiring from aerospace engineering, Eleanor had developed a habit of late-night tinkering, filling the hours with disassembling and rebuilding gadgets that no one else wanted or needed. She turned back to the disassembled shortwave radio on her dining table, her tools glinting under the warm light of a desk lamp. The vibration intensified. This time it was undeniable. The hum resonated in her chest, a deep, thrumming note that sent a wave of nausea through her. Eleanor froze, her fingers hovering over the delicate wires of the radio. Then the light bulb above her began to flicker erratically, casting distorted shadows across the room. Outside, a greenish glow washed over the street, filtering through the curtains like moonlight gone sickly and wrong. Eleanor moved to the window again, her stomach tightening with dread. The air shimmered as though caught in a heat mirage, but the temperature had dropped. She could see her breath fogging up the glass. That was when she saw him. Mr. Callahan, her elderly neighbor, stood motionless in his yard, his silhouette stark against the unnatural light. He was dressed in his usual flannel pajamas, his wiry frame hunched forward as though he was staring at something on the ground. Eleanor thought to call out to him, but stopped herself. There was something deeply wrong about the way he stood, too rigid, too still. The hum grew louder, and Eleanor's ears popped. She covered them instinctively, but it was useless. The sound was inside her head now, vibrating against her skull. She stepped back from the window, heart pounding, as Mr. Callahan's body began to change. At first, she thought he was moving, but then she realized his skin was bubbling. His arms and chest swelled grotesquely, as though something inside him was trying to claw its way out. Pale streaks of light glowed beneath his skin, racing along his veins like rivers of molten metal. He opened his mouth in a soundless scream as his flesh split apart with a wet, sickening tear. Eleanor clapped a hand over her mouth, fighting the urge to vomit. She stumbled back from the window, knocking over a chair, but her gaze remained locked on the scene outside. Callahan's body was no longer human. It was a cocoon of oozing, gelatinous material, pulsating in rhythm with the hum that now seemed to shake the entire neighborhood. The cocoon began to shrink. It folded in on itself, collapsing like a balloon punctured from within. When it was gone, all that remained was a perfect, glowing circle scorched into the grass. Eleanor stared at the empty yard, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. There were no remains, no blood, no sign that Mr. Callahan had ever existed. The glow in the street dimmed. The vibration ceased. The world returned to its usual stillness, but Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching her. She locked her doors and drew all the curtains, pacing her small living room as the terror subsided enough to let her think. She grabbed her phone, hesitating only briefly before dialing 911. The line was dead, not even static. Eleanor tried the landline next. Nothing. Her internet connection was gone too. Her house felt suffocating, as though the walls were closing in. Grabbing her coat and flashlight, she ventured outside to confirm what she had seen, her every nerve screaming at her to turn back. The circle in Callahan's yard was cold to the touch, its surface unnaturally smooth. It pulsed faintly, the glow dimming and brightening like a dying ember. She crouched down to inspect it closer and noticed something embedded in the center. A fragment of metallic material that didn't reflect light, but seemed to absorb it, shimmering with an otherworldly fluidity. As she reached for it, her hand stopped just short. A faint voice echoed in her mind, a whisper she couldn't make out but felt compelled to obey. Shaking herself free, she stepped back, her instincts overriding her curiosity. Across the street, another house lit up in that same sickly green glow. The humming started again. Eleanor ran. The following morning, the news was ablaze with reports of mass disappearances across the region. Official statements from government officials cited a potential biological hazard of unknown origin. Entire neighborhoods had gone silent. Their residents vanished. Martial law was declared in several cities, and the evacuation of high-risk areas began immediately. Eleanor watched the televised announcements with growing dread, clutching a mug of cold coffee. The official narrative didn't make sense. There was no mention of glowing circles or pulsating cocoons. The authorities were lying. Or worse, they didn't understand what was happening either. She turned off the TV and sank into her armchair, staring blankly at the floor. For the first time since her retirement, she felt the familiar pull of her old instincts as an engineer. An urge to make sense of the incomprehensible. Whatever was happening, it wasn't random. There was a pattern here, and she intended to find it. The hum returned that night. This time, Eleanor was ready. She didn't know what she was looking for, but she knew one thing for certain. The world she had lived in all her life was gone. Something else had taken its place, and it was watching her. The evacuation orders spread like wildfire, accompanied by mandatory sirens that howled through cities, towns, and even rural stretches of land. Those who resisted were labeled extremists, with the media painting a grim picture of biological contamination zones and the looming threat of airborne pathogens. Yet for Eleanor Mendez, the unease she had felt during the first disappearance only deepened. She knew the official story was a sham. What she had seen with her own eyes, the pulsating cocoon, the glowing circle, the sickening transformation, was not something a virus could explain. She wasn't alone in her suspicion. As the evacuations intensified, a handful of others surfaced in the chaos, drawn together by their shared disbelief in the government's explanation. They banded together in the husk of a small-town observatory abandoned during the first waves of the quarantine. Here, Eleanor met the others who would become her reluctant allies in the search for answers. Marcus Carter was the first, a burly self-proclaimed survivalist with a knack for fixing electronics. He had stockpiled enough supplies to wait out the end of the world if necessary. His skepticism of authority ran deep, fueled by years of military service that left him disillusioned with power structures. He had seen the strange circles too, on the edge of a nearby forest, and was determined to understand them. Janie Clark, barely 18, had fled her home after watching her parents vanish before her eyes. She brought with her an unshakable determination to fight back, even if she didn't yet know how. Her youth contrasted sharply with her eyes, which carried the weight of grief and a simmering anger that threatened to boil over. Dr. Hakim Abbas, a biologist specializing in xenobiology, was the anomaly in the group. He claimed to have seen patterns in the disappearances that suggested a deliberate, orchestrated design. His insistence on the involvement of something non-terrestrial made him an outcast among his peers, but his theories intrigued Eleanor more than she cared to admit. The group's initial meetings were tense. Marcus bristled at Hakeem's academic jargon, Janie was quick to lash out at anything resembling authority, and Eleanor, reluctant to trust anyone, kept her observations to herself. But as reports of entire cities disappearing in the blink of an eye reached their ears, they realized that cooperation was no longer optional. One night, while monitoring shortwave radio frequencies, Marcus picked up a faint looping transmission. At first, the static was indecipherable, but after some tinkering with his makeshift equipment, the message became clear. It was a distress call. A woman's voice repeated the same phrase over and over, desperate and fragmented. Circle, pulsating. They're watching. Don't touch it. The signal cut off abruptly, leaving the group in stunned silence. It was the first confirmation that someone else had seen what they had, a connection to the glowing circles that marked every disappearance site. Determined to investigate further, the group set out for one of the most recent sites, a small suburban community just outside the city. What they found there shattered any lingering doubts they may have had about the nature of the disappearances. The neighborhood was eerily intact, save for the absence of life. Cars remained parked in driveways, lights flickered in some of the houses, and children's toys lay abandoned in the yards. But the air was heavy with an unnatural stillness, a suffocating silence that pressed against their ears. In the center of the neighborhood, they found a glowing circle scorched into the asphalt of a cul-de-sac. Its surface was unnaturally smooth, like glass, and it radiated a faint, sickly green light. Dr. Abbas crouched down to examine it, his hands trembling as he unpacked a small collection of tools from his satchel. That material, it's not just organic, he muttered, his voice thick with a mixture of awe and dread. It's a hybrid, something biological fused with something else, something I don't recognize. Eleanor had been silent, standing at the edge of the circle and staring at its faint glow. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The hair on her arms stood on end, and a cold sweat broke out on her brow. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The group froze, straining to listen. At first, there was nothing. Then, faintly, the low hum began. It was the same sound Eleanor had heard that first night, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and burrow into the skull. Before they could react, the shadows at the edge of the neighborhood began to move. At first, it looked like the trees were swaying in the breeze, but then the shapes became clearer. Something large and grotesque slithered out of the darkness, its body an unnatural amalgamation of glistening black chitin and oozing tendrils. Its form was almost humanoid, but elongated, its limbs too thin and too long, its head featureless except for a faint bioluminescent glow. The creature emitted a clicking sound, a rapid staccato that reverberated through the air. Another emerged from the shadows, then another, their movements jerky but deliberate, as if they were scanning the area. Marcus raised his improvised electromagnetic pulse device and aimed it at the nearest creature. "Get ready to run," he growled. Before the creatures could close the distance, Marcus activated the device. A sharp, high-pitched whine filled the air as the pulse shot out, causing the creatures to convulse violently before retreating into the shadows. But as they fled, One of them left behind a piece of itself, a chunk of quivering, pulsating flesh that writhed like a severed limb. The group didn't wait to investigate further. They grabbed the sample and fled back to the observatory, their breaths ragged and hearts pounding. Whatever was happening, it was clear now. The disappearances weren't random. They were deliberate, and the creatures weren't just observers. They were collectors. The sample pulsed faintly in the dim light of the observatory's lab. Eleanor, Marcus, Janie, and Dr. Abbas crowded around it, their faces illuminated by its sickly glow. The chunk of alien flesh had not stopped moving since they had retrieved it, and every now and then it emitted a faint clicking sound, not unlike the creatures they had encountered. Dr. Abbas adjusted his glasses with trembling fingers as he prepared to begin his analysis. He had set up a makeshift biolab using salvaged equipment from the observatory and the supplies he had brought with him. The air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the hum of a portable generator. "This thing is alive," Abbas murmured, his voice both awed and horrified. "Even separated from its host, it's functioning." "What do you mean, functioning?" Marcus asked, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "It's just a chunk of meat." Abbas shot him a sharp look. "It's not meat, Marcus, it's adaptive. Watch." He placed a scalpel against the sample's surface and made a small incision. Instantly, the flesh rippled, a cascade of light racing across its surface. The wound closed itself within seconds, leaving no trace of the cut. Janie, standing a few feet back, let out a soft gasp. That's not normal." "No, it's not," Abbas said grimly. He adjusted the microscope and examined a small sliver he had managed to extract. As he peered into the lens, his expression darkened. "This material isn't just alive, it's a hybrid, a fusion of terrestrial DNA and something else." "Terrestrial?" Eleanor asked, leaning forward. "You're saying this thing has Earth origins?" "Yes," Abbas replied, nodding slowly. "Some of its DNA matches known Earth organisms. But the rest, it's completely foreign. Whatever this is, it wasn't born. It was made." The weight of his words settled heavily over the room. Eleanor exchanged uneasy glances with Marcus and Janie. The idea that the creatures, and by extension the disappearances, were part of a deliberate design was chilling. Over the next several hours, the group pored over the data Abbas collected. The more they uncovered, the more disturbing the picture became. The alien material seemed to respond to specific frequencies, emitting patterns of light and sound that Abbas theorized were some form of communication. More alarmingly, it seemed to exhibit signs of sentience, subtle movements that suggested it was aware of its surroundings. "This isn't just a tool," Abbas said, his voice tight. "It's part of a larger system, a network." Eleanor, who had been sifting through the files they had recovered from the government server, suddenly froze. She stared at the screen, her eyes widening as the pieces began to fit together. "I think I've found something," she said, her voice shaking. The others crowded around her as she scrolled through a series of declassified documents. The files were incomplete, heavily redacted, but what remained was enough to confirm their worst fears. The disappearances weren't a new phenomenon. They had been happening for centuries, scattered across the globe in isolated incidents. "There's a pattern here," Eleanor said, pointing to the screen. "Every incident involves the same glowing circles, the same strange biological remnants, and each one coincides with a spike in electromagnetic activity." That can't be a coincidence, Marcus muttered. It's not, Eleanor replied. She opened another file, this one marked with the highest level of classification. These experiments, they've been happening for hundreds of years. Different locations, different populations. The government has known about this the whole time. Janie's face twisted with anger. Known about it? You mean they let this happen? They didn't just let it happen, Eleanor said bitterly. They studied it. They've been tracking the disappearances, gathering data, and now they've lost control. Abbas leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. This changes everything. If this has been going on for centuries, then the creatures aren't invaders. They're part of something bigger. A system. A system for what? Janie demanded. What could they possibly want? Eleanor hesitated before responding. She scrolled to a final file, her hand trembling slightly. The document was fragmented, but one word stood out. Experiment. They're testing us, she said quietly. The Earth. It's a test bed. These creatures, this material, the disappearances. It's all part of some kind of experiment. They're trying to create something. Create what? Marcus asked. Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper. A perfect society. The group stared at her in stunned silence. The idea was too monstrous to comprehend. Abbas was the first to speak, his voice heavy with dread. If that's true, then the disappearances aren't random. They're selective. They're harvesting people, Marcus said, his tone grim. Taking them somewhere else to build this society. Not just people, Abbas corrected. They're taking the best parts. Traits, behaviors, even DNA. They're breaking us down and rebuilding us into something new. Janie's hands clenched into fists. So what happens to the people who disappear? Are they dead? No, Eleanor said, shaking her head. Not dead, transformed, integrated. Her words hung in the air like a death sentence. The group's collective horror deepened as they realized the implications. The disappearances weren't the endgame. They were just the beginning. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. The observatory was silent, save for the occasional hum of the generator. She sat by the window, staring out at the stars, her mind racing. The truth they had uncovered was more terrifying than anything she could have imagined. Humanity wasn't under attack. It was being reshaped, piece by piece, into something unrecognizable. She thought about the glowing circles, the pulsating cocoon that had consumed her neighbor, the grotesque creatures that had pursued them. They weren't just agents of the experiment. They were its byproducts, half-formed iterations of whatever the experiment was trying to create. And then there was the most chilling thought of all. The experiment wasn't over. In the corner of the room, the alien sample pulsed faintly, its movements almost hypnotic. Eleanor could have sworn it was watching her. As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, she made a decision. If the experiment was still ongoing, then they were running out of time. The final stage was coming, and if they didn't stop it, they would be the next to disappear. The road to the Nevada crater was desolate. Winds whipped across the barren landscape, carrying with them a faint metallic tang that clung to the air like a warning. Eleanor sat in the passenger seat of the beat-up van, gripping the edge of her seat with white-knuckled hands. Beside her, Marcus drove in tense silence, his jaw set and his eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of movement. In the back, Janie sat hunched over, her arm wrapped tightly in gauze. The infection, or mutation, was spreading fast. Her skin was now translucent, her veins glowing faintly beneath the surface, a harrowing reminder of what awaited them all. Dr. Abbas was gone. The creatures had taken him during their escape from the observatory. Eleanor could still hear his screams echoing in her ears, see the way the tendrils had wrapped around him and dragged him into the darkness. They hadn't had time to mourn. The urgency to act was too great. In the center of the van sat the electromagnetic pulse bomb, a crude yet powerful device Marcus had cobbled together from spare parts. It was their last hope, a desperate attempt to sever whatever connection the creatures had to their alien hive and, if they were lucky, destroy the experiment's core. Eleanor glanced at Janie. The girl's breathing was shallow, her head resting against the cold window. Her transformation had slowed since they had injected her with a cocktail of adrenaline and antibiotics, but it was only a matter of time. Janie caught Eleanor's gaze and gave her a weak smile, the glow from her veins casting faint shadows across her face. "I'm not scared," Janie whispered, her voice barely audible over the engine's hum. "If it gets me, if I disappear, promise me you'll make it mean something." Eleanor swallowed hard, fighting back tears. She nodded but couldn't bring herself to speak. The crater loomed ahead, a jagged scar in the earth that seemed to pulse with life. The alien structure at its center rose like a grotesque spire, its surface a shifting mass of organic and mechanical components. It radiated a sickly green light, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. The hum they had heard so many times before was louder now, vibrating through the ground and into their bones. As they approached, the van began to sputter. The electromagnetic interference from the structure was too strong. Marcus cursed under his breath, slamming the steering wheel as the vehicle rolled to a stop a few hundred yards from the crater's edge. "We go on foot," he said, grabbing the pulse bomb and slinging it over his shoulder. "This ends here." Eleanor helped Janie out of the van, supporting her as they made their way toward the crater. The air grew heavier with every step, thick and oppressive, as if the atmosphere itself was resisting their presence. The hum morphed into a discordant chorus of clicking and chittering, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. When they reached the edge of the crater, Eleanor froze. The ground below was teeming with movement. Thousands of pulsating cocoons stretched as far as the eye could see, their surfaces slick and glistening. Inside each one, faint shapes writhed, human shapes, their faces frozen in expressions of pain and terror. "Oh my God," Janie whispered, her voice trembling. "They're still alive." The realization hit Eleanor like a physical blow. The disappeared weren't dead. They were being remade, reshaped into something alien and unrecognizable. The sight was both horrifying and strangely mesmerizing, a grotesque reminder of the experiment's purpose. A deep, guttural roar echoed across the crater, snapping them out of their trance. From the base of the spire, the creatures began to emerge, dozens of them, their elongated forms glistening in the green light. Their movements were deliberate, almost calculated, as they formed a perimeter around the group. "They know we're here," Marcus muttered, his grip tightening on the pulse bomb's trigger. "Eleanor, you need to go. Take Janie and get out of here." "No," Eleanor said, her voice sharp. "We do this together. No one gets left behind." Before Marcus could respond, the creatures surged forward. The fight was chaos. Marcus fired the electromagnetic pulse in bursts, each blast sending the creatures into convulsions. But for everyone they incapacitated, more seemed to take its place. the air filled with the acrid stench of burning flesh and the unearthly screeches of the creatures as they writhed and reassembled themselves. Eleanor and Janie pressed forward, weaving through the mass of cocoons as they made their way toward the spire. The ground beneath their feet was slick and pulsing, as though the crater itself was alive. Janie stumbled, collapsing to her knees, her glowing veins now spreading up her neck and across her face. "Go," she gasped, pushing Eleanor away. "You have to finish it." "I'm not leaving you," Eleanor shouted, tears streaming down her face. She tried to lift Janie, but the girl shook her head. "It's too late for me," Janie said, her voice breaking. "But you can stop this." Before Eleanor could respond, the ground beneath Janie erupted. A massive tendril shot out, wrapping around her body and lifting her into the air. Eleanor screamed as Janie was pulled toward the spire, her body glowing brighter and brighter until she was nothing more than a blinding flash of light. The creatures faltered, momentarily stunned by the burst. Marcus seized the opportunity, shoving the pulse bomb into Eleanor's hands. "Go!" he yelled, firing another burst at the approaching swarm. "Finish it!" Eleanor hesitated, her heart pounding. Then she turned and ran. The base of the spire was a writhing mass of tendrils and flesh, pulsating in time with the hum. Eleanor climbed its surface, her hands sinking into its slimy texture as she struggled to reach the top. She could feel the structure fighting back, its tendrils lashing out and trying to pull her down. When she reached the summit, she saw it, the core of the spire, a glowing sphere of shifting light and shadow. It pulsed like a heartbeat, each wave of light sending ripples through the crater below. This was the heart of the experiment, the control center for the creatures and their horrifying purpose. Eleanor activated the pulse bomb, setting the timer for 30 seconds. She placed it at the base of the core, her hands trembling. The sphere seemed to sense the threat, its light intensifying as the tendrils around her began to thrash wildly. As she turned to climb down, a tendril wrapped around her ankle, yanking her off her feet. She screamed as she was dragged toward the core, its light consuming her vision. For a moment, she felt weightless, as though she was floating in a vast, infinite void. Then the pulse bomb detonated. The explosion tore through the spire, sending a shockwave that rippled across the crater. The cocoons disintegrated, their occupants collapsing to the ground in lifeless heaps. The creatures shrieked and convulsed before dissolving into pools of viscous liquid. The spire itself crumbled, its light fading until only darkness remained. Eleanor's vision blurred as she lay at the edge of the crater, her body battered and broken. She could hear faint voices, human voices, calling out in confusion and fear. Survivors. Somehow they had been freed. As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, Eleanor closed her eyes, a faint smile on her lips. The experiment was over, or so she thought.